will bear true friends and allegiance to the Constitution.
9th October 1996. A momentous event, if one could call it that, in the checkered history of Jammu and Kashmir. Well, in a sense, it was historic. 7 years of bloodshed, madness, terror and pain. And then, these elections. I guess the question I was really asking myself was, could this really be that moment which could deliver to this land of mine a new freedom from its many years of violence, uncertainty and chaos? And yes, possibly a freedom from fear. Though I must admit, my visit to the valley was mainly to capture the taking over of a new government. There was also an element of curiosity, an uncontrollable urge to somehow search for my past, a present, and then also a future emerging from this chaos. And what better way to do it than traveling along this legendary river? Jhelum, Vyeth or Vyeth, as it is popularly known here, is to Kashmir what the Ganga is to the rest of India. A river that witnessed both the growth of its civilization and of the city of Srinagar itself. The Vyeth had weathered it all, invasions, destruction and devastation. Dark eras and some golden ages too. Journeying up the Vyeth was like voyaging into the past. A past that I shared in common with lakhs of Kashmiri Pandits scattered all over the world. Somewhere deep within me, the sounds of these verses had bound me to these ancient temples. Remains of an ancestry that not long ago founded the city of Srinagar as we know it today. As I stood there, among the remains of a day long forgotten, a deep sense of calm seemed to engulf me. A calm that had as much to do with the serenity of the surroundings as it had to do with the eeriness of the present era. It was as if the bare walls of these ancient shrines enveloped within them the only remaining expressions of our faith. Perhaps the only link Kashmiri Pandits like me had with the valley of today. Everything here seemed just the way I had seen it years back. The temples, icons of our gods and goddesses. Even the mystique and charm persevered. Well, almost everything. In a physical sense, that is. Returning from the shrine of Tulmul, our team halted at Gandarban, a town on the banks of the Sindh River. This was Farooq Abdullah's constituency, the region from where he stood for elections and won. Yet to my surprise, the tranquility prevailing here seemed far removed from the politically surcharged atmosphere in the valley. It was as if this town of Gandarban lay frozen in time, unmindful of the change of events that had been gripping the entire valley around it. Yes, October 96 did seem a far cry from the Kashmir I had been a witness to just a couple of years back. It was as if a new feeling of rejuvenation had set in. But how did this change come about? What really caused the turnaround in the valley's political atmosphere? And most importantly, how did a society, seemingly on the brink of disaster, return to normalcy? I can still very clearly recall the autumn of 1994. My first day in Srinagar that year was a civilian curfew imposed by the militants. Deserted streets, empty roads, abandoned and burnt houses greeted me and my camera team everywhere we went. An engulfing fire seemed to consume almost each and every living memory of my childhood. Lal Chowk and its Palladian cinema. I've lost count of the number of times I've bunked school to catch the latest Hindi films here.
ये छोटा घर
Our house at Rawalpora.
जो हमारे पिताजी ने हमारे भाई ने बनाया था.
The house my father and brother lovingly made. A victim of this bloody carnage that rocked Kashmir. It was as if the land I'd grown up in was far removed from the ground realities of the day. Fear, it seems, was the only emotion enveloping Kashmir those days. Fear from the gun, from fundamentalists, from foreign mercenaries, and yes, also from the forces that were trying to stem the rot. The dilemma and uncertainty were complete. People would always get killed in a war, any war for that matter. And yes, among them would inevitably be a civilian population, sandwiched between their own perceived heroes and villains. The question inevitably was, which side would a person support? The side of the fundamentalists, who had started becoming a law unto themselves, ruthlessly silencing their critics? Or the people who confronted them, the keepers of law and order in this land? The question of good or bad hardly mattered. When the mind tended to be insane, choices did seem a bit limited. After all, war had its own codes, its own rules, its own laws. August 1994 and October 1996. 2 different years, 2 different environments. For me personally, this moment inflamed some burning apprehensions and expectations. Apprehensions about the ground realities of the day. And of course, expectations of a new beginning. And a new beginning it did seem. Well, at least that is what I could deduce from the enthusiastic reception Dr. Farooq Abdullah was receiving at a victory parade. 3 days before he assumed power, and already a string of complaints, pleadings and inquiries had begun to make their presence felt. As I stood observing the proceedings, I couldn't help but reflect on the moments when this trouble all began. Although the seeds of this unrest had been sown much before, with entities like the Jamaat-e-Islami and the more recent Muslim United Front coming to mind, the situation really worsened in 1989. Success in securing the ransom of 5 militants for the kidnapped daughter of Mufti Muhammad Saeed, the then Home Minister of India, came as the initial spark. And soon, cries for Azadi, or independence, rent the air. Material support from across the border took care of the rest. And the result? A low-intensity proxy war under the guise of jihad was unleashed in the state. Yet, ironically, the first victim of this religious war, as it had been branded, was Kashmir's uniquely secular cultural base. A base that had as much to do with music and folk dances as it had to do with Sufism and belief in mystical philosophies. Anathema to the fundamental Islamic thinking as propounded by organizations like the Jamaat-e-Islami. Attacking these traditional values and forcing a culture and philosophy alien to this region was where the first seeds of discontent were sown in the valley. The Hazrat Bal crisis of 1993, that lasted nearly 31 days, was diffused after a long, protracted psychological battle, and that too without making any concessions. In fact, the militants' failure to manipulate and maneuver this hostage scenario into an explosively potential crisis was probably their first serious setback. Perhaps the first major jolt to the secessionist forces, who seemed to be having it their way till then. The one significant factor that really turned the tide around was the rise of a new power. A second faction of militants, anti-secessionist in leanings, who added a whole new dimension to power politics in the valley. Their rise was as much a revolt against the militant leadership, now in the hands of foreign mercenaries, as it was a response to the changing political perceptions sweeping the valley. Sonawari, the den of local anti-militant leader Kukkapari. A former folk artist and now an elected member of the state's new legislative assembly. One of the most important leaders of the anti-secessionist forces, the adulation and support Parre enjoys underlines the role reform militants like him had played at a critical